Hello and welcome to this video on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K. I had this camera for about a month now and I want to share my initial experience as well as my opinions on it with you. Now, to prefix this, I did this video already, but then I realized I was running 5-year-old firmware. And I didn't realize initially, but Blackmagic supports the cameras for a long time. So here we go again. First, let's start with the camera's design and specs. The Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, or 6K as I call it from now on, is a relatively large handheld camera with a Canon EF mount and a 6K APS-C sensor. It supports Blackmagic RAW and Apple ProRes in multiple formats, and with newer updates even supports Blackmagic's version 5 color science. But let's talk a bit about the body first. One thing that shocked me when I first held this camera at the store was how large it felt. For comparison, here's the smallest camera I have. A Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, the original one. And here's the Canon EOS 5D Mark II. As you can see, the 6K dwarfs the EOS, and it looks even more gigantic than it actually is, thanks to the gigantic bump at the front that is needed for the flange distance of the lens. I don't have a lens on there, as you might notice, so once you have a lens on it, it's even larger. But of course, this is a relative comparison. The 5D is a photo camera. And considering the capabilities of the 6K, which I'll get back to in a moment, this is a tiny camera, so no complaining there. Despite this large size, it's extremely well balanced and feels good to hold. I was surprised how well this camera handles despite its size, and I'm happy to hold it even though that is seldom the use case of the camera. Onto the specs, this camera has a really nice sensor with a resolution of 6144 by 3456 pixels. It supports shooting at Blackmagic RAW at full res APS-C and 50 fps and up to 120 fps in 2880 by 1512 cropped RAW, as well as 60 fps at 4096 by 2160 cropped in Apple ProRes and 3840 by 2160 in APS-C at 60 fps as well. It supports recording in 3 color ranges. Film, which is used for high quality edits, giving you the most dynamic range possible and leaving the doors wide open for quality grading, especially in scenes where you might want to change the exposure in post-production. Extended video, which can be used for quick editing without the need for much grading while still keeping enough dynamic range for adjustments. And video, which will give you Rec 709 straight out of the box, allowing you to have consistent footage between cameras for live streaming or when you don't intend to grade your footage. The camera also has a lot of functions to assist you in shooting, like a forced color mode, where different brightnesses are colored differently, allowing you to quickly ascertain the exposure of your shot, a LUT preview allowing you to see how your footage will look once graded without losing data in the recording, and many more. This camera is overall just very well featured, leaving cameras like the Lumix DC-S5, which I did a review on as well by the way, in the dust. Aside from its many features, the camera also has an excellent user interface. Maybe a few fewer buttons than I'd like, a joystick would have been nice for example, but enough to make for an enjoyable experience using the camera. That user interface is dominated by the large touch screen, providing every function easily accessible for even complicated tasks. However, what the camera makes up for with the touch screen, it lacks in buttons in my opinion. There are quite a few remappable buttons, like the 3 function buttons at the top, but it's missing a way for me to change settings, like the recording format without the touch screen. I think a camera should have that, as it's far more efficient in my opinion, although you're unlikely to have to change those. Aside from that, it also has a dedicated ISO, shutter time and white balance button, as well as an auto iris button, a remappable autofocus button, a zoom button to magnify the camera's preview, a button for enabling high frame rate, a menu button and a playback button. In terms of connectivity, the camera includes a USB-C port for P2P transfer, a webcam connection and external drive recording, a full-sized HDMI port, headphone out, 3.5mm mic input and a mini XLR input. There are 2 storage slots, one for SDXC UHS 2 and one for CFast 2.0. Bluetooth connectivity is also available for remote control and other functions. Now let's move on to example imagery. Starting off with daytime B-RAW footage in the full color range, we can see the magnificent dynamic range of the camera. You can see detail in the sky as well as in the dark spots of the trees. Moving on to the Blackmagic Film V5 LUT applied, you can see that this is already perfectly fine footage. which just shows how well supported by Blackmagic is. Also worth mentioning, this LUT is available in DaVinci Resolve, so it's as easy as selecting it during editing. Cutting to some handheld footage, we can see one of its bigger drawbacks: the lack of internal image stabilization. This is not uncommon for a camera of this class, however, it just means you have to use a gimbal. Moving on to some nighttime footage, shot at an exposure time of 1/30th of a second and an aperture of f1.4. Let's start with an ISO of 200, where you can predictably not see a lot, so let's raise it to 400. This starts getting you some detail, but as it's still not particularly usable, let's move on to 1250 ISO. Now we can see one of the strengths of the camera, the dual ISO, giving great noise levels and dynamic range even at high ISOs. This is also where you can really start using the footage, but there's more, so let's keep going. At ISO 3200 we start getting details in the tree line and the noise is still under control, but raising it to 8000 there's already a lot more noise. This is the upper limit I'd ever shoot, and Blackmagic seems to have the same idea, as that is the highest preset in the selector. But it's not the limit, that goes to 25600. And as you can see if you're watching this at the highest bitrate, there is a lot of noise now. But as much is expected, and sadly that's a consequence of using an APS-C sensor. Also, this is obviously quite a long exposure time, so if you're shooting at 60 FPS or even 120 FPS, you might end up with quite high ISO. Finally, let's talk about how I feel about this camera. It's obviously quite a step up in filming performance compared to a Lumix S5, and it's surprisingly easy to use. The interface is well designed, and Blackmagic regularly releases updates for this camera as well, which is great to see. And of course, you can't do a Blackmagic camera review without mentioning the great work they've been doing in their color science. The footage out of this camera is beautiful and really shows how far relatively cheap cameras have come. Another great feature of the camera is the integration into other Blackmagic hardware, for example the Atom Mini series. And connected via an HDMI cable, the camera shows a red light if it's the active output, quickly indicating to the host which camera is shooting. And of course, the fact that you can remotely control the camera's color settings with the Atom software on Windows and macOS. On the flip side, I have a few complaints about this camera, be they minor. First of all, its lack of image stabilization. It's not a feature commonly found on this type of camera, as it will spend nearly all its time in a cage or mounted on a tripod, but it's a feature I was missing the first time I used it. Another drawback that I already mentioned is the APS-C sensor. Of course, as we all know, sensors get exponentially more expensive with size, and this camera couldn't hit the price point if it had a full-frame sensor. But especially for nighttime footage, I will prefer my full-frame cameras for now. And lastly on my list is the display. While it's large and really bright, it's not articulated in this version of the camera. But that's such a minor complaint, as you'll mostly have an external display and you're frankly very unlikely to use this camera in a one-man shoot, unless you're crazy like me. Overall, I really like the Blackmagic Design Pocket Cinema Camera 6K, despite its ludicrously long name, and it really does fill the void between the more conventional cameras like the Lumix S1 and the larger movie cameras like the Ursa. If you need great footage for your projects while keeping your setup compact and easy to use, I can wholeheartedly recommend this camera. I hope this video was useful to you. If you have any feedback, questions or experiences you want to share, feel free to do so in the comments below. This video was shot on the Lumix S1, S5 and the 6K of course. I'm out, have a nice one.